All right, we'll get started. I'd like to call to order the Finance Committee. It is Tuesday, August 25th. It's 5:32. I'm going to take roll call. Myself present, Mr. Hoffman,
Present.
Mr. Girl,
Present.
Mr. Fiducia. I think he was on the line. Yeah, mute. Yeah, Dave's there. Just unmute your mic when you get it.
How's that?
All right. Mr. Schultz,
Here.
Mr. McDonald,
Present.
Mr. Butita.
Here.
All right. Let the record reflect we have a quorum. Mr. Chapman, do we have anything on from public comment?
No.
All right. See none. We'll move on to our item, which for today is 2021 budget information and discussion. Before I let Steve Chapman present the two items he has for us, I believe he sent out an email earlier that you guys should have got it. So if you have it handy, it's hard for those that don't have paper on them, so or doing it Zoom. So just pull up your file if you have it and have Mr. Steve Chapman present it to us. All right, Steve, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. What I sent out today is a couple items that I want to talk about tonight in relation to the budget itself. As you can tell, we're kind of this year things are a little bit more sporadic than what they've been in the past. I guess it's just a matter of trying to get everything done in time for the budget to lay over. But a couple items that I think are important for the committee to consider here in the next 30 days before we actually approve the budget by the end of September. One is the tax levies, and the other item that I sent out was the host fee information. Let's talk about the tax levies first. The sheet I sent you is, again, just a preliminary review of the levies and the estimated tax rates for next year. First of all, the assessed valuation, good news in that respect is that we're seeing growth of about 5.4% in our assessed valuation for next year. These are pretty good numbers based on the assessment books that have been turned in to the supervisor of assessments office and so on. So I'm pretty confident in terms of where those numbers will end up. Obviously, you have to factor in something for any board of review changes, things such as that. But we usually, I think, take about 0.5% off for the board of review. So it brings us back to that 5.4%. In terms of the calculation we do every year as far as what the limiting rate is for the county, we calculated that, and again, that's an estimate, but based on the numbers that we have, the new property from the supervisor of assessments, also the assessed valuation increase and so on, we should be fairly close to the number that we've come up with in terms of what that limiting rate is. Again, that isn't calculated until the spring once all the assessment information and that is done. So the rate that we came up with, if you see under that note that's on that page, the top page there is 94.474 cents per $100. That would be the county's limiting rate. The fiscal year 2020 extensions, which is the current fiscal year, those extensions were $39,260,000, and that actual rate that was reflected on the tax bills was 96.61 cents per $100. The levy dollars that we've included on this particular sheet reflect, I believe, an increase of what, 170,000, 174,000. That reflects the new property for, or what the valuation would be for the new property, the $18 million in new property. That's what the increase in levy would reflect. And then we've also reflected the what those rates would be based on the assessed valuation. A couple of things that we did do, we moved some dollars from the tort judgment fund over to the general fund. And that's reflected in the tax amounts that are actually flowing into the general fund this year. It looks like we had less claims paid out and so on for this year. Our workers' comp numbers, I think, are down. We've done better in that respect over the last few years. So we did move 600,000 from the tort judgment fund over to the general fund. We also had to increase the IMRF fund by about 500,000. That was more in terms of, I guess, what projected expenditures are, plus the debt service that we have to pay for the bonds that we did issue. The actual rates have gone down a little bit, especially the rate for the SLEP people, which is the sheriff's deputies and that. But to reflect the appropriate revenue in that fund, we did have to move that particular amount up. We were able, based on the fact that the detention home revenues from the state and so on have increased over the last couple of years. The state's been very generous in giving us money for the additional positions in that. We actually reduced that levy down somewhat. We had increased it significantly last year to do some catch up in terms of what we wanted the fund balance to be at. So I guess the other important thing in terms of looking at the taxes is if the board decides they want to incorporate any of the PTEL extension amount, the 2.3% that is the rate of inflation from last year. If we look at taking that entire levy next year, or I guess and reflecting it in the property taxes, that's about $900,000 that we would be able to generate in terms of additional revenues, presumably to apply against the general fund, but there may be some need in the nursing home fund also. That's a tax rate difference of about 2.13 cents per $100. And if you kind of look at it from, your average taxpayer that's got a $150,000 house, that would, they'd be paying about $9 more for that increase in that levy for the PTEL amount. I know in the past we haven't done that, but I think given the circumstances this year, I think the board's going to have to look at that option very strongly. So, are there any questions with respect to the levy side from anyone?
Mr. Butita, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is strictly the property tax part of the budget revenue. There's nothing else included. The numbers from, well, I guess last week were presented.
That we talked about, no, this is strictly dealing with the property taxes. And the reason I put this together was to not only look at all the different levies, but also look at what would be available if the board so chose to raise the levies. So.
Any other, yeah, Mr. Schultz?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just curious about the significant increase in the veterans assistance line.
That's somewhat twofold. One is we've seen a significant increase in benefits that we've had to pay out for the individuals that are requesting the benefits. I presume with the unemployment rate, the way it's been, I think people are, forced to come down there and seek those particular benefits. The other item has to do with the administrative costs for operating that department, and there's that number isn't firm yet. I have to meet with them and go over some items. So that may end up being reduced somewhat. They've incorporated a request for health insurance for their people in that particular request. In the past, we haven't funded that, but I need to talk to them about that particular item. But it's a combination of both of those items.
Follow up, Mr. Schultz? Okay. Anyone else have any questions on the tax levies?
I do, actually.
Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Thompson does.
Yes, Steve, if the board were to allow for the increase from 92 to 94, the 2.13 cents, would then the board have the ability to distribute that increase throughout where we see it's needed most?
Yeah, I mean, as long as we don't exceed the maximum rates, which are on that column to the left.
Right.
Most of the levies or the rates are not close to that. So, and some of them have no limitation, like the general fund.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, it would,
Okay.
that they would have that discretion.
Anyone else have any questions on this piece of it? Yes, go ahead, Mr. McDonald, and then Mr. Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like most other years, I think this committee is usually fairly divided as far as property taxes go. I understand that we're in a very unique situation. I also, at the same time, still can't support a property tax increase. Maxing out levy is going higher. I understand Mr. Chapman's points for sure, and we know what parts I'm gonna have arguing points for later, but I will be supporting raising the property taxes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Schultz?
Yeah, thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Just as it relates to the nursing home operation, maybe others of you are familiar with the information that came out in the audit report, where there was that huge negative cash position, the 3.3 million that I mentioned previously to the Republican caucus and talked about at the night of the audit review. But it does kind of beg the question as we get into this that we would have some kind of at least a synopsis of where do we find ourselves now. There was this huge receivable balance, but even the significant receivable balance now almost a year ago would not have solved their problems if we collected it. We would still have had a significant negative cash position, and to the extent that that's been carried forward or just whatever the update is, we need to have that. I'm particularly concerned about fund balance as it relates to borrowings during the course of our fiscal year, because we're now dropping to a point in our fund balances where we have the potential of having serious cash flow problems. And I just want to make sure I understand how what the status is of the nursing home, as well as how that fits into our overall status of our cash flows. Thank you. I don't need that now. I just want it somewhere in the course of the budget conversation.
Sure.
We can get that information for you.
All right. Anyone else have any questions on tax levies and the presentation that Mr. Chapman just presented to us? All right. Seeing none, I guess we'll go on to the host fees, Mr. Chapman.
Okay, I thought it would be, appropriate to talk about the host fee fund also, given that it's a fairly significant amount of money that we put out each year plus take in. What I did is the first page, which is page 2 of what we had passed out previously, is the fund equity forecast for the host fee. Reflects previous year's actuals and so on. The projected for 2020, the current fiscal year, and the projections for 2021. As far as projections for this year, if you go to the second page, it reflects the expenditures that we've had over the course, or projected to have over the course of the current fiscal year, the different multi-year commitments that we've paid out, other one-time payments that the board has approved, and the annual payments. So this number is actually pretty accurate. The only thing that I know that changed since I actually prepared this is I believe the RLDC, that COVID-19 Emergency Business Loan Program, I believe we received a reimbursement check back from them for the remaining amount that we had, $75,000. So actually that the expenditures would actually go down by that amount. I think we got that last week. So
We get all 75, everything we put in.
Everything we put in has been paid back. So that's good. So anyhow, the numbers on the bottom reflect the quarterly payments that we've received this fiscal year. The last one is an estimate because we don't get that until October. The amount to the right is the numbers that are paid out to New Milford based on the agreement that we have with them. So in terms of this fiscal year, we started out a fund balance about a little over 4.3 million. We took in revenue about 4.6. Anticipated expenditures, which is reflected there, about 3.7, which leaves us with a fund balance about 5.30 at the end of this current fiscal year. Fiscal year 2021, and again, these are based on the multi-year commitments that we have, the different projects, plus the payment on the bonds for the Series 2012 G bonds, a little under 2.5 million. The annual payments is pretty much the same as what we did in the current fiscal year, about 515,000. We also put what we just call a host fee reserve, which would be, any other projects that may come along during the year that the board so chose to fund the $1 million, which gives us total anticipated expenditures of about $4 million. We're anticipating revenue to be down a little bit from what the current fiscal year is, about 4.3 million. We received money back. We will be receiving money back from the RLDC, that small business loans program that we had. 40,000, plus we get 20,000 each year from Loves Park and McChesney Park for their share of the airport project for the maintenance MRO out there. So we're looking at it. Total anticipated revenue about a little under 4.4 million. Expenses about 4 mil. Gives us estimated fund balance little under 5.7 million at the end of next year, given the assumptions that we've incorporated into this particular budget. As far as the information, and again, I'm bringing it to the committee and to the board. If there's any reason to utilize any of these funds for other purposes during the fiscal year, given the financial issues that we're having, there appears to be monies within those funds that could be utilized. So again, that's a board decision, but again, it's dollars that could be available for that purpose. So
Thank you, Mr. Yes. Looks like Mr. McDonald has a question, and then I have a comment. Go ahead,
Thank you. The question I have, Steve, is I don't think it's a good idea to use this money for operational costs because it throws a whole bunch of kinks in a bunch of different areas. But can we use these revenues for part of our reserves? Because they are available to us should we need to pull them.
Well, presumably we could, but the reason the reserves are going to be the way they are is because of the expenses that we have. So if you don't, you could move money over for that purpose, but in essence, you're trying to, you would be funding, part of the expenses that you do have. So.
And I think reserves are a good idea, and Carla had pointed out that it's going to help with bond ratings to have a reserve. So I'm just curious if we can point to this to show that we do have.
Well, you probably have to move it over to either the 1% fund or the general fund. Normally, the bond rating people haven't really looked at this fund per se when they review our finances and that. There was none.
They look more at the general fund.
General fund and 1%, yes. Yeah. So in the review that we did this spring when we issued those bonds, there was no mention of this fund at all. So
thank you.
All right. So I got a couple questions, actually more comments than anything. I do appreciate Mr. Chapman putting this together. From a perspective, I think we've had this discussion about using host fees monies in operations and et cetera, primarily when it's to cover wages for FOP contracts or ASME contracts. There's a concern there, essentially, that we'd be giving that as a bargaining chip on negotiations. So that's one piece of it. I don't disagree with potentially using it. There was talks about investing some sort of money, to accumulate interest, whether it's through a policy of equity and obviously fixed income, CDs, whatever you want to call it, doesn't pay much, but essentially we have some sort of money generating back and forth, whether it's 3%, 6%, depending on the market, that we could get that, 3% of 5 million, it's about $150,000, not much there, but it is a huge chunk that we could use for the community that we currently give out to on our host fees money. So, so set that aside. I do think it's something to look at, not necessarily in favor of using it just for the sake of using it, because it's there. Obviously, the intent of the host fees, we have a policy in place of what we can use it for and what we cannot use it for. So I'd like to continue to use that policy in place. I talked to Mr. Chapman a couple of days ago and last week and this week and today, kind of trying to get a budget when it comes to a balanced budget. And so I've asked Mr. Chapman to kind of look at, so for full disclosure, to kind of look at what that balanced budget would look like, what kind of money, and two-prong approach. One is to kind of look at what money cannot be touched based on our current expenditures, staffing, et cetera, what money we cannot touch whatsoever. And then the other bucket would be essentially what there is to essentially work with. So let me give you an example. If we have $100 million going back, Mr. Chapman would do the exercise of saying, we're at, say, $70 million that we can untouch. So then the 30 million would be in play, all right? And so strategizing to see what that balanced budget would be from this perspective. And I say this from the finance chair guy here. We are at a point, and we have been at a point where we need to make cuts, especially this COVID incident that kind of occurred. It's continuing to occur with revenues falling. We need to strategically look at cutting one shape or form. I'm not a big proponent because services will be affected. I don't like services being cut whatsoever. But at the end of the day, we do have to make those strategic decisions to allocate the funds accordingly across the board. So services that are really impactful and prioritized to that need, we do so. But I'd like Mr. Chapman to take that exercise, look at what that balanced budget would be, and move forward. Think about it this way. We talked a little bit about it last week when Mr. Chapman proposed the recommendations currently based on the budget. We would fall under, for next year, we would fall under that 25% magical number. As Mr. Schultz has alluded, it does eat into our cash flow. So there's, I believe, a $5 million gap there. So to get to that 25%, give or take. So we'd have to figure out whether it's from the revenue side or whether it's from the expenditure side of reductions. So the recommendation will always be to have that 3-month worth of salary available for employees' payroll, which equates to that 25% 3-month for that aspect of it. So that's where the discussion currently is. I know we're against time again and trying to get a budget passed here shortly, but that's the exercise to look at and look at recommendations, how we move forward in making those reductions. It's never going to be a favorable. We've had these discussions multiple times, but at the end of the day, we need to make those adjustments accordingly based on our revenue trends, where we're going, and how we're generating income essentially versus our expenditures. So I just want to set the tone for that, have this discussion right now for those that are in the finance committee. But from my perspective, I think it's a well exercise to look at where our balanced budget, what that would look like, what direction we need to head in. As we said, people don't want to increase taxes. That's fine. Well, then one has to give the other. So my understanding and from my perspective to say I'm going to take $5 million out of a host fee, 2 million, 3 million, from my perspective is irresponsible and just hiding, the issue at hand that we have currently right now, which is we need to adjust to our revenues and whatever we're doing versus our expenditure. So that's just from my standpoint, from the chairman of the finance committee. I'd like to essentially get a shape idea if whether it's revenue generating that we have 2 million, 3 million that, is out there, so be it. But also, getting to closer to that budget, a balanced budget, more importantly, since, this COVID thing is a good wake up call potentially, what it could be catastrophically across the board. Good thing that we had the CARES Acts, good thing that we have a couple things coming from a federal and state level, but this is something that we need to look into and essentially making those decisions strategically. Not only that, but being viable for the future. So I think I've said enough so far, and I'd like Mr. Chapman to push forward with that proposal, showing us where that balanced budget would look like, and kind of working on a strategy essentially to decide what's the best alternative currently for Winnebago County to move forward and to execute. So comments, questions, concerns about the budget. This is the appropriate time that we need to have these discussions. I'd like to hear from board members on this committee themselves as well. So I'd like to also start getting this information out to the county board members as a whole, so they have it. So it's not one of those things that, it's the 12th hour, and we're signing in at the very last board meeting. So I know we're short on time, but that's where we're at. So I'll open the floor for questions, comments. I think it's a good time to discuss things, ideas that we might have. So unless there isn't anything, then, we'll leave it at that. Yes, Mr. Girl.
Thank you, Chairman. I just want to know if we do know revenue increases through the PTEL or anything else, exactly what would the number be that we would have to cut from throughout the county? Is that 5 million, 7 million, 8 million, 10 million? Do we know?
Mr. Chapman, with your proposal last week, that incorporated taking in just the construction, correct? And for the most part, there was some other revenue that was incorporated in there, but that captured essentially currently what the state would be for the county going into next year. Is that correct? Is that a fair statement, Mr. Chapman?
Yeah, the property tax levy information that we talked about tonight reflects the new construction in that. Right now, the PTEL, you got about $900,000 that you would be able to generate through that, going to the max.
So Mr. Chapman, just to give Bert a quick synopsis, what would a balanced budget look like? Currently, we have our revenues, the projected that we did. I believe it's about $8 million gap, correct?
Oh, let's see here. Trying to look.
Was it 5.4?
Well, that's 5.4 will put us at the
25%.
25%. Otherwise, just if you're talking about a balanced budget in both funds, it's about 6.4 million that you have to find.
All right, and just to follow up, if I could.
Yep, go ahead.
Do we know where $6.4 million could be cut from if we look at this budget? Is there $6.4 million in fat that the county has sitting around in budget? Because I just don't believe that we do.
And this is where that exercise, Bert, as I kind of mentioned, that I want Mr. Chapman to kind of look at to see what we cannot touch whatsoever, right?
Yeah, there's definitely things that are by statute that we have to provide.
Contracts that we cannot touch, things that we, grants that we necessarily have to give to tax levies, et cetera, et cetera. And then kind of saying we have X amount of money that is flexible for us to make decisions on what areas we can cut. All right. So it's a two-prong approach. To top of the head, I don't know if Mr. Chapman would be able to provide us that information right now to say if 6.4, there is fat out there. To say there is fat out there would be an understatement across the board, since we have been in the past cutting, right? I hear county board members were at bare bones out there in departments, right? So this is where, you know, it's an exercise for Mr. Chapman to go back and kind of look at that.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, I'd love to see what he comes up with. As far as I know, there's no fat. We're into the bone and the muscle right now. So we're going to have to figure out by state statute what departments we can live without. What departments can the folks, the taxpayers live without? Because I just don't see us, you know, getting $5-6 million cut out of these budgets without any kind of revenue increases. So hopefully I'll look forward to seeing what Mr. Chapman comes up with. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions at this point? Yes, Mr. Butita.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm obviously in favor of a balanced budget, but I'm willing to compromise expenditures and revenues. But I think before we even get to that discussion, I think Mr. Schultz is correct. We need to have an understanding of what's happening at the nursing home. And even to take it one step further, should we be in the nursing home business? I think, Steve, you told me the enrollment out there is, it's in the 50s, is that correct?
No, it's I think right now the census is about 135.
Okay.
We haven't been able to add new residents because of the COVID issue.
So the first issue for the community, because when I got elected, I had a number of people tell me, you know, don't get rid of the nursing home. It was important to people. But if we're continuing to lose money at what the auditors told us in 2019 is the case, and if that trend has continued, I have questioned whether or not we should be in that business. And so that factor in itself would go a long ways to mitigating these other factors. So we need to have an understanding of what's going on now at the nursing home, because obviously our billing and our funds are down, our revenue's down, our expenses are going up because we're paying, we just approved to pay the employees more emergency.
We haven't done that yet.
We haven't approved that yet, but okay. In any extent, we haven't got any revenue there. So I think that's an important part of this whole discussion, is that the nursing home has to be well discussed and researched. Thank you.
Mr. Fiducia, you had your hand up.
Thank you. Just to help Mr. Butita understand, we've gone down that road several times, and the nursing home was brought onto the county by an ordinance or a referendum, and I don't believe we can get rid of it, just say, hey, we're going to sell it, or to get rid of it. I think what we have to do is it has to go on the ballot to you know, get rid of that nursing home. So I don't know if Mr. Chapman can back me up on that or not, but I believe I've read over and over again where the nursing home was put in by the voters, and there's an ordinance that's got it there, and I think we're kind of stuck with it for right now. I do agree with you, though. It's something that's bleeding us dry, but I'm almost thinking that we don't have a revenue problem. We might be having a spending problem, and we're going to have to kind of cork it a little bit in all departments. But Mr. Chapman, I don't know if you could substantiate what I've said on that, but I do believe it's not as easy as just saying we're going to get rid of the nursing home.
Well, the state law requires, I believe, that if you have a referendum that build a nursing home, which River Bluff was, the law requires that you have a referendum to, if you want to sell it. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can't lease it out to someone else. I believe, I'm not certain of what the law says, but I know about the referendum issue. I'd have to get back to you on the other issue. That was actually a law that was approved downstate, and Zeke Georgie brought it in back when a former board chairman was going to try and sell the home. So, but I'd have to get some additional information for you on that.
Anyone else? Yes, Mr. Oh, hey, Mr. Tissoni, how are you?
Good this evening. Thank you, Chairman, for allowing me to speak. You know, I haven't, whether or not this 2.7 million overspending of the sheriff's budget, whether that's approved or not, where does that fall into this potential 6.4 budget shortfall for next fiscal year? Or is that not even in that equation?
That's really not in that equation. That's for the current fiscal year. We're talking about next fiscal year.
Okay, all right, well, and just for the record, Jaime, Mr. Chairman, I mean, just to let you know my thoughts, what I could live with, and not in relationship to the 2.7 million at the sheriff's budget, but the 174,000 on the new tax for the new property, myself, I can live with a voting in favor of the tax increase for inflation, which is the 900K, which puts us at roughly over $1 million. And I could live with taking some host fees to soften the blow in other areas, not necessarily just one item, but maybe something from 3 areas that help and soften the blow. Myself, I'm really against layoff or cutting jobs of $15 an hour people, because it takes a lot of those persons to make up big numbers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tissoni. Anyone else have any questions, comments, anything? Yes, Mr. Schultz, and then Mr. McDonald.
Yeah, I'm going to try not to rehash and replow old fields just for all of our sake. But I do think the idea, the concept of multi-year projections, financial projections are going to be very important for us. I've made this request in the past. I'm making it again. I really believe getting an understanding of where the contract agreements that we already have on file, where those raises that we've agreed to with the unions will put us as it relates to changes in our salary and benefits. We already have some of that information. I also think, you know, while it's difficult to project, I think it's an excellent exercise. In the process, we would see, for example, the bond payments that would be dropping off. I know that we tend to capitalize on that and immediately issue new bonds for everything that's dropping off, but I still think that that's a meaningful piece of our cash flow, and it would be good information. I also think that we could look at projections on new revenue. We know that we've got the marijuana revenue that we'll know more about as we actually get it, and as we see what the sales are, and as we understand, you know, what are the dynamics of that. So all those go into this multi-year projection. I think it's really hard for us to make one-off, one-year decisions about using fund balance when we don't have the larger picture. And in relation to that, you know, I've seen historically, and I don't mean to be sour grapes, but I've seen a lack of will essentially to deal with our problems. And so I don't believe that's magically going to change now. And as a result, I think that we are going to use more of our fund balances. But I haven't heard, and I don't think the other board members have heard well, what are the real consequences of that? Other than just like this specter, this cloud of, oh boy, that's really bad. The more you take out of your reserves, it's a bad thing. Well, I think we need more specificity. I think we need to have the board empowered and informed at what point would our bond rating be affected. Not that it's a boogeyman, but just where would that actually happen, or what's our best guess? And at what point would, yeah, we've got this fund balance at the end of the year, but during the course of the year, based on the timing of our cash flows of when tax revenue actually comes in, when would we potentially have to borrow? Because, yeah, that's the year-end balance, but during the year, we dip into that in order to pay our bills until later in the year we get revenue coming in cash flow. So I think that's another piece of this. Okay, at what point in our fund balance dropping would that become a real issue? And if we wiped out our balances, I don't know the answer as to what difference would it make? You know, what specifically, other than it being generally a bad thing. I heard Ted Biondo say that, well, you're going to have to do tax anticipation warrants, and they're really expensive, and you're always spending next year's money if that's the place you get yourself to. But okay, I don't know if that's, I like Ted, right? But I don't know if that's accurate, and I don't even know how we would live in that world. My concern, honestly, is that with the lack of political will in solving our problems, that the default will be that we will, over the next 5, 6 years, whatever it is, wipe out our balances. I think the board needs to be empowered to understand what that would actually produce. And so they stare that in the face and say, am I going to leave that scenario for my colleagues in the future? At least you're doing it with information and not just some, you know, general idea. I also think that we need to take up the conversation regarding solving future year's problems immediately after we approve this year's budget. What happens is we have these conversations, we all look at each other with glum faces, we're all sad about it, it's very painful, you know, everything comes together at the last minute, we spend some of our reserves, and then we don't talk about it until almost a year later. You know, we're going to end up having a multi-year problem, and so getting after, you know, solution side of that is going to require ongoing conversation and not just once a year discussion. So I would just plead with us, okay, we're going to do some horse trading. The last minute we'll pull this together. We're going to spend some of the reserves probably, but then the next chapter of it, we will have baked problems into this year's budget. I promise you, we will have kicked the can on certain things, and we have to start stepping into that, you know, as soon as possible, so that we're taking our responsibilities going at it. I also believe that the host fee balance is a bridge, and it's a bridge if we're actually responsible about solving our problems, right? If we don't really take that seriously, it's not a bridge. It's just, you know, a short-term political solution. It keeps us from feeling the heat. But in the context of us actually grappling with our situation, I do believe that the host fee funds would be a part of that solution. Thanks for listening.
All right. Are there any other questions, comments? Mr. McDonald, yes.
Hey, Chairman Salgado. I think Mr. Schultz brings up a good point, Mr. Chapman. Have we tried to figure any marijuana sales tax into any of it? I know that there's not much information, but did we even give $100,000 towards it?
Yeah, we did. I think we put 200,000 in there.
Yeah,
200.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I missed that. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Yeah.
I know 2007 to last, did our revenues come close to get back to where they were? Or are we, I thought I saw the chart that Carla had produced. We were close to back to where we were prior to the Great Recession, weren't we?
Well, I mean, that was before the COVID recession.
Sure. Oh, no, yeah.
So,
COVID aside, I agree with you.
I mean, I don't know what, I haven't looked at those numbers, but you know, revenues are one thing, it's expenses are the other. I mean, if you look at our expense side, you know, I'm sure that's gone up more than the revenue side. And the problem with the revenues, so many of them are dependent upon what the state does. You know, they can, as an example, our replacement tax, the state can just come in and grab $500,000 and nothing, no problem. I mean, that's how they do stuff. You know, probation reimbursements, they didn't fully fund their reimbursements for probably 10 years. And then they actually started doing something, I think, a year ago because the Supreme Court got on them. But I mean, the whole issue of, you know, sales taxes now with people, you know, buying everything on the internet. The brick and mortar places aren't getting the sales they used to. So I mean, it's not only a revenue issue, but it's also an expenditure issue, and you know what you're paying out. So
Thank you. It's way too early to jump on Mr. Thompson, but I look forward to, you know, I'm glad that you're here for this cycle.
Yeah.
But like Mr. Schultz said, we need a multi-year plan. We look forward to working with you soon, once this budget is done. You know, what else do you see in addition to your experience? You know, Mr. Chapman is very glad that he's around. But in your unique experiences elsewhere, to collaborate and see what can we do to invest in our future. I agree with Mr. Chapman, brick and mortars are not doing well. And so what are we going to do in 3 years and 5 years and try to maintain our revenues and decrease our expenses? Probably isn't overly realistic, but how do we get back ahead of this ballgame?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yep. Any other questions, comments? Yes, Mr. Butita.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I only have a question. Is I'm a relatively new member to this committee, and I missed last year's budget cycle because I was out of the country. So I'm just curious as to the process that we're going to go through in the next 5-6 weeks. That time-wise, a timeline is that on September 3rd, I believe, was at the next board meeting that we had to submit a budget. So is it our intention as a committee to submit a budget that's balanced at that time, or is that just a working?
I think it's a working document.
Okay.
And we'll try and make decisions in the month of September.
Okay.
It's obviously a week away, so we're not going to have the time to do things. I really had this meeting tonight to start getting people to think about things. We're going to actually Thursday night present probably the information on the general fund, and also the information I presented tonight to the board, so they have that information. I did go through this information with the elected and appointed officials on Monday, so they had the same information that you folks had. So if there's any information or questions that they have, they can raise them at this time as opposed to the end of September or whatever. So
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and go ahead, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. My question's for Mr. Chapman. Steve, if we did nothing other than cut staffing for $6.4 million to make up the budget shortfall, what's that look like across the board, percentage-wise, on staffing cuts?
well, that's one of the things that we're going to try and determine based on the request from Mr. Salgado, as far as what amount of expenditures could we actually cut to make that up. I mean, between the two budgets, it's $90 million, but there's quite a bit in there that you can't cut. You can't cut your bond payments. You can't cut your election costs. You have to have elections. You have contracts with municipalities that you're paying deputies for. You can't cut those. So that's the exercise that we're going to do, and I'm going to try and work on that tomorrow. So along with everything else. So I didn't answer your question, but I think once we have that information, it'll be easier to give you that number.
That's good enough. Thanks, Steve.
Yep.
So Final thoughts from my perspective. I just want to let you know, I do appreciate Steve's comments. I think those have resonated across the board. 5-year plans, whatever, budget projections for that. I'm not making excuses up here. We've been always seem to be in this stage every single year. We say we're going to get started. Not justifying giving excuses anything on this year, but we all know what transpired with the COVID. Trying to figure out where our revenues, just trying to figure out where we're going to end up this year was pretty darn difficult to do so. And Mr. Chapman can attest to that. The long conversations we would have ever since May hit. Trying to figure out, hey, budget's coming up. Where do we think we're going to end up? And then that's when the projections came in. This is where we think the revenue is going to be at. What's downfall? 8 million, whatever. So I'm not trying to make excuses for this. Very different scenario. One thing that I want to bring up that could help us in the future. Sorry, not that I like the Park District or that have some bias towards them or because I worked for them, but and I spoke to a couple of the board members on this, and I've made this comment before multiple times, and it's Mr. Haney started the process of interviewing with NIU on the different priorities that we have out there that we think are very important for our county as a whole, right? Based on what we hear, what our constituents are saying, and trying to dictate what our priorities are, for the next 5 years, whatever we want to talk about. Now, a COVID can come in and change the whole landscape. Well, we need to adjust. No one's saying that plans can't be changed at any time or uncertainty comes into play, right? But at the end of the day, we have those priorities set. If it's economic development, if it's infrastructure, if it's whatever, if it's the public safety, and then we start basing our priorities on that, and we start establishing our budgets around those scenarios. It makes it a lot easier for someone to say, we're cherry picking, we're picking on these departments, we're essentially being biased towards these departments, or we're being good stewards to these departments across the board. The other issue that we have to deal with, and I understand the Park District is pretty straightforward because they get their tax levy and they determine who gets what based on the priorities in their survey that they do from their guests, from their people that use their services, right? Unfortunately, what we have against us is we have elected officials, right? State statute requirements on certain positions that are out there within the county. So that makes it a little bit more difficult. But at the end, though, from my perspective, if we have our priority list and we agree for, it's kind of like our objectives, our mission, what we're trying to accomplish for the county as a whole, then we can start, putting our budgets together. So there is no, well, you know what, that's anti-public safety. Oh, well, that's anti-nursing home. Well, that's, it eliminates the whole almost politics that goes into play, right? It gives you the information saying, hey, well, majority of the county board members that represent constituents say these are the priorities: infrastructure, public safety, whatever down the list. And that's how you allocate the funds accordingly, right? And it takes out that. So that is something for the future. It's something that we're trying to implement, that we were trying to implement. I understand that things aren't going, we're still at this 12th hour kind of deal that we're doing. But at the end of the day, whether it's 25, whether it's 25%, whether it's, nothing at all to using host fees or a balanced budget, we have to make those decisions, right? And unfortunately, I think it has to be done now. We've been kicking the can down the road, as we say, on these aspects, and we beat ourselves over it, and no one wants to step up to the plate. And like I said, many times. We're in this position because we get paid the big bucks, and we have to step up to the plate and be responsible for that. And so we owe it to the taxpayers, and that's what we need to do, right? Whether it's not increasing the CPI or just construction or whatever the case may be, we need to make those decisions strategically. Not only that, but going forward, and have that open mind frame on that direction. So hopefully, Mr. Chapman, we can work with you and see what we can come up with for the county board as a whole. And hopefully the county board can really start to paint the picture that, what we have been doing for the past 5, 10 years, 15 years, whatever it is, on that path. So based on sales, based on whatever revenue declines that we've seen across multi-years. So just want to continue to reiterate that, and I will continue to be that. I know Mr. Biondo, myself, don't always agree on certain things, but I think we have to be accountable, we have to be transparent, and we have to make sure that we're good stewards of the taxpayers. So with that, unless anybody has any questions, yes, Mr. McDonald, and then Mr. Groh.
I would just like to point out that if we look to out west to Seattle and their cuts to law enforcement and the business that they're fleeing that area now because they don't feel safe and they feel it's not a good place to do business. Again, I'd reiterate my commitment to public safety, that I really don't think we should balance all this on public safety. Going into this budget cycle, I know you guys every year hear me about it, but I think we've got a terrific example of what happens when you cut law enforcement, and when businesses and people don't feel safe in an area, they leave that area. So that's why let's make sure we're doing the right things for the right reasons. Let's not cut from one area that's going to accelerate possibly our decline in revenue. Thank you.
And if I may respond, Mr. Groh, I don't think anyone here is saying that we're going to cut drastically or just one department whatsoever. I really hate these discussions about, I'm pro public safety, and that means that you might be anti public safety. I'm not saying that that's what you're saying, but I just want to be clear. I just want to be clear that this in no intention is pointing out one selective department whatsoever. That may be someone's assumption in that case. I've tasked Mr. Chapman to look at a balanced budget, what that would look like, money available, unavailable, and start to make decisions strategically that way. In no shape or form is anyone saying, let's take it out of this department 100%, or some people would have problems with the nursing home or whatever department it is. And so strategically, we have to be smart about things, right? And I take your comment about Seattle and some other cities across the nation that, are feeling the heat about defunding police and, what the implications would be. I think we're well aware. I think Mr. Our chief of police in Rockford yesterday came out with Miss Marilyn Height-Ross on the, shootings that are occurring across our city. So I think we're well aware what's happening, and we take those comments, concerns seriously. So your point is well taken on this, Mr. McDonald, but I just want to reassure that no one, from my perspective, is saying that we are going to move into that direction. Mr. Groh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want just a few comments. Mr. Schultz alluded to a forecasted budget. I think that's something that we really need to look at, whether it's a 3-year or 5-year, to forecast that out. I think you hit the head on these bond payments that are coming up and whether or not we rebond or actually use that money, which I would suggest that we do for now, unless something comes up. But Mr. McDonald brought up the Seattle budget for the police. Their budget for their police department is $400 million. They cut the budget by $4 million. So it wasn't a significant amount of money. So just to keep that in mind, they went from 400 million and they cut 4 million from that. So we're not talking about eliminating police services, just a different way of how we deliver police services, and are we doing it the most effective way? So I think we can look at that. And also just kudos to the IT department. I can hear everyone in the room and it's so much better than last week. So kudos to Gus and his team. Thank you.
Yep. Very good.
Yes, I agree too. I can hear no echo. Anyone else? Mr. Hoffman, you're pretty quiet today. Any comments for us? No? All right. So with any other matters to come before us? Yes, Mr. Schultz.
Yeah, you heard my relatively cynical comments, and I want to, while I believe everything I said is true, I also want to call out the excellent leadership that you're providing, Chairman Salgado. I want you to know that I appreciate your efforts. I want you to know that I appreciate your vision and your tenacity, and I want to encourage you in those efforts. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Schultz, for the kind words, but Mr. Chapman and the team, well deserved as well. As you know, we pick on them. Hey, what's this? Can I get this information? Can you do that in the short amount of time? So kudos to them as well. And thank you. We will continue to push forward. I think we want the best for our county. So any other comments, questions, anything for the Finance Committee? Mr. Chapman, Mr. Thompson, anything else?
No, thank
Okay.
you.
All right, seeing none, can I get a motion to adjourn by Mr. Gurl, second by Mr. Schultz, and Mr. Butita? All in favor, signify by saying aye.
All right.
All right, thank you very much. Have a good night, guys.
Thanks, guys.
He's like Gary Tree. He never says an opposed.